Joanne, first of all, it's a pleasure to have you here today. We've been colleagues for many, many years, and you know that I have the greatest respect for the work that you've done for many years as director and continuing on up to the present with the Medieval Studies program here at Georgetown. You developed the initial seminar for the Medieval Studies program and came to the conclusion that the best way to introduce medieval studies was through Dante. Tell me a little bit about that founding experience of teaching the age of Dante.
It was not a difficult decision to focus on Dante. Dante is so interdisciplinary in his scope, and the course was an interdisciplinary course reflecting the interdisciplinarity of medieval studies. And as we began to think, both from the literary and from the historical point of view, Dante pulled together so many elements of the Middle Ages that it was an obvious choice. And in thinking about it, and thinking about the ways in which Dante reflects the Middle Ages, you can start simply with the sort of his bringing forward the classical figures, both mythologically and in terms of the classical authors, so that his personification of Virgil, his dependence on Virgil, his love of Virgil, his text is permeated with Ovid, with Statius, with Lucan, so that he, in a way, in that regard, is very proto-Renaissance. He really revived, in a sense, the pride, especially of Italians, in their Roman classical past. So that is simply one brilliant component of the Divine Comedy. But also embedded in the Divine Comedy is Dante's intense study of Scripture. His belief, which comes across particularly in De Monarchia, but also comes across in the Divine Comedy, that the church needs to turn its attention back to Scripture. And in that sense, I characterize Dante as a proto-Reformation figure because his, and it's not too strong to say his anger at the church.
Absolutely.
Is in part due to the development of papal decretals and papal traditions that he thinks moved the church significantly away from the message of Christ. And as a result, he is uncomfortable with the church and its temporalities from the period of Constantine forward. And so he would love to have seen the church go back to its original foundations and Scripture. And in that regard and in that enterprise, he himself brings Scripture to bear throughout the text on virtually every point that he makes.
So that there's something, in a certain sense, something very Lutheran about Dante.
Almost.
Yes, in the sense that nothing should come between the believer and Scripture, not even the church.
Yes.
Now, Dante would not quite have taken that in the direction that Luther did, but I think you're pointing to something very important. It's almost, I've always think of it in terms of, it's as if Dante were saturated in Scripture. It's as if he had been swimming in Scripture for years and years and years, probably to some degree recognizing its cultural importance, but also personally seeking their direction, consolation in his exile, that he really lives in the heart of Scripture.
Yes. You know, he has this amazing balance between the spiritual and the real, the reality, so that he is embedded in Scripture, but at the same time he's attentive to the ongoing politics of his period.
Right.
And as a result, he gets very involved, and he had himself his own political career, which we can track. He ended up in exile from 1302 on till his death. He lived his life in exile. The Divine Comedy would not have been developed if he hadn't been in exile. In that regard, as an exilic poet, he becomes a model for the human race, in the sense that we are all pilgrims, or as Augustine would have said, we are all pilgrims, and in some sense we are all exiled. And so therefore the poem becomes our poem because we all have this experience of exile. Dante perhaps more poignantly and brilliantly expresses that sense of exile. But he did spend the rest of his career in exile, and that did not stop his politics. He remains political to the very end. Even
stridently so.
Stridently so. And as a result, he is, in De Monarchia, he develops not only is it an attack on the authority of the modern church from his perspective, but it is a call for a political call, an idealistic call for a form of government that allows for a society in which men, and I say that advisedly, men, can reach their full intellectual potential. And in that endeavor, peace becomes requisite.
Yes.
So for Dante is even though he's strident in his politics, he is a poet of peace.
Yes.
And he's very much engaged with thinking through, very logically, in De Monarchia, how that kind of peaceful society could evolve.
Students often ask me in class, didn't he get in trouble for this stuff when he said all of these things?
Well, he did.
Yeah.
Well, but the problem for the church was that the Divine Comedy was so immediately popular.
Yes.
Something like 600 extant manuscripts exist before the end of the 15th century. That's amazing. And more than, for example, the Roman de la Rose, which was the most popular French text in the 13th and 14th centuries. But the Divine Comedy is extant in more copies. Because before the Divine Comedy, Dante was a figure, but after the Divine Comedy, he was the figure.
Yes.
But he also began, of course, as a courtly poet. Very young, beginning to write when he was in his teens. And the Vita Nuova was his first effort at gaining fame.
Yes.
And attention within the poetic circle in which he grew up.
And that was very much part of the motivation, wasn't it? He wanted his poetry to be known.
He wanted his poetry to be known. I mean, his very first poem, as far as we know it, he sent out to get responses from a variety of people, and some of them praised it and some didn't. But he had a body of poetry, and what he did in the Vita Nuova is so unusual, and again, what tells us immediately that Dante's mind was an original mind, that he rarely set his mind to something that wasn't innovative.
Right.
Unusual, attention-getting, and important in a very large sense. But in the Vita Nuova, he does something very unusual. He provides a commentary to lyric poetry. And that's an academic exercise that he engages in, but it's also a way of providing a framework and giving attention to the specifics of a specific romance. He makes it clear that he's talking about a specific woman.
Yes.
And that is so unusual in the courtly love tradition.
And he struggles with that even within the text, because he talks about the need to hide who this, at the same time he's revealing, he's talking about, well, obviously I tried to conceal it as best I could, which is an extraordinary irony in the text, isn't it?
Yes, of course, because the text itself is revealing that.
Yes.
So, and then, the ending of the Vita Nuova, which is so intriguing, in which he leaves you with the sense that he must have had the idea of the Divine Comedy very early in his life.
Yes.
And it is attached to his adulation of Beatrice. And in the evolution of his love for Beatrice, he does something in the Divine Comedy then, which, as he said, he wanted to do beyond. He wanted to say of her that which has never been said
of a woman before in
of
verse.
any other woman.
Isn't that extraordinary?
And he does it. That's what's so extraordinary about Dante, is that he then achieves it. What he does in the Divine Comedy with regard to women is extremely important, because even though there are numerically fewer women in the Divine Comedy, they tend to inhabit paradise.
Yes. Yes.
And as he moves, of course, from Virgil, he moves to two female guides, so Matilda and then Beatrice.
Right.
And then, of course, the Virgin Mary is embedded throughout the entire text. So there is a way in which Dante takes the courtly lady, spiritualizes her to an extent much more extreme than was true of any of his predecessors. I'm thinking of Guido Guinizelli, for example. And successfully manages to create this extraordinary image of a woman who is intellectually superior, who is motherly in a very spiritual sense, and and stern as needed, but a culmination of a love that has become a completely spiritualized love.
Yes. And then there's that wonderful image. He's got a feminine trinity.
Yes.
I mean, how radical
Yes.
is that theologically in that context?
Yes, Dante
Mary,
is nothing if not radical.
That's right. Always something new.
Always something.